Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would talk about this little topic because this is the only topic that has really interested me within the past week. I apologize for not posting as much this week, but I just haven't really seen that much going on. I probably should have commented on UFC 262 because I usually do comment on the big cards, and there is a big fight happening tomorrow, so I apologize for that, but I certainly will give a fight review on that if any of y'all are interested. But anyways, man, so I thought that I would talk about this topic for boxing when it comes down to it because there's a lot of people talking about this topic, especially ever since Demetrius Andrade crashed or tried to crash Canelo Alvarez's post-fight conference against Billy Joe Saunders. Basically, what happened, Demetrius Andrade went there and he said, well, when are we going to get a fight going on, all sort of stuff. And Demetrius Andrade was wearing a shirt apparently saying that Billy Joe Saunders and Canelo Alvarez were avoiding him and all sort of shit when it came down to it. And Canelo Alvarez basically told Demetrius Andrade to get the fuck out of his press conference. And that basically he don't fight nobody and that he's a horrible fighter. Basically pimp slapped him verbally and told him to get the hell out of there, and he was escorted out of there. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with Demetrius Andrade calling out Canelo Alvarez in a press conference, but you know, when I looked at the reactions of the boxing fans for this fight, there's really no one begging for a Canelo Alvarez versus Demetrius Andrade fight. And that really is the problem about this fight. I don't think it's a bad fight. I think that Canelo Alvarez versus Demetrius Andrade, I think it's a good fight. I think overall that it's kind of on that same level as Canelo Alvarez versus Billy Joe Saunders. I think it's an A-grade fight, and a certain amount of people may disagree. Of course, you have a lot of the mainstream channels that have tried to say, oh, Demetrius Andrade, man, he's levels above Billy Joe Saunders. No, he's got... In all reality, he's not. And that's kind of the problem. I have certain people try to tell me that, in the comment sections when I've made videos about this, well, you're not doing enough research. Billy Joe Saunders and these guys, they've had shaky performances against all these guys. That's fine. Listen, man, I know what I'm watching when it comes to these fighters. Demetrius Andrade, I think, is a very decently talented fighter. Let me also answer this question real quick because someone asked me this question actually today in one of my comment sections when I talked about this. And they asked me, who do you think personally would win in a fight between Demetrius Andrade and Canelo? I think Canelo Alvarez would dominate Demetrius Andrade personally. That's what I personally think. I don't think that there's another fighter within those weight classes that is on the same level as Canelo Alvarez. I think really the only fighters that I would be if I were a Canelo Alvarez fan, the only fighters that I would be very uncomfortable with Canelo Alvarez facing would be the 175 pounders, the two elite fighters, which would be Dimitri Bivol or Artur Beterbiev. Those are the fighters that I would be concerned with if Canelo Alvarez were to face those guys next. These 160, 168 pounders, don't get me wrong, I think they are quality fighters. I think there's a lot of A-grade fighters there. But just like how Floyd Mayweather Jr. was the number one pound-for-pound fighter before Canelo Alvarez, just like how he was dominant, I think Canelo Alvarez has really transformed himself into a number one pound-for-pound fighter. I believe he is the number one pound-for-pound fighter of today. I don't think that there's any doubt in my mind about that, and I think Canelo Alvarez would beat Demetrius Andrade. I'm not going to say that he would stop Demetrius Andrade, although it wouldn't be impossible, but I think overall that he would beat him. I think that he would pretty much have the same tactics against Demetrius Andrade as he would against Billy Joe. And I think that overall he'd be the more accurate striker. I think he would take advantage that Demetrius Andrade sometimes can be a little bit sloppy. Sometimes can go for certain risks that are not worth taking. And sometimes Demetrius Andrade can be a little bit too hittable. That's just personally what I see. Listen, man, bottom line is this. I don't mind seeing the Canelo Alvarez versus Demetrius Andrade fight. I think that it's a decent fight. But once again, and I've said this in a certain amount of my videos, no one is begging for a Demetrius Andrade versus Canelo Alvarez fight. No one cares if Canelo Alvarez faces Demetrius Andrade next. Now, if he faced a long line of bums, then it might be something different. If he was facing, I'm trying, multiple Avni Yildirim's throughout his fights, it'd be a little bit different. But that's the problem. He's not. He's facing a lot of top contenders. He's facing undefeated champions. And the certain amount of channels out there, they can allege all they want to that, well, he's going on this European tour and everyone knows that the Caucasian fighters are not as dominant as the Latino and the American black fighters. All sort of bullshit when it comes down to it. All that is understandable. when it comes down to it. You know, the Caucasian or the European fighters, they're not usually as dominant as the black fighters or as dominant as the Latino fighters in boxing. That's understandable. But in these certain weight divisions, they're pretty much on the same level as those Latino and as those black fighters. And a certain amount of people ain't going to like that. But it is what it is. Billy Joe Saunders, Caleb Plant, Callum Smith, they're nearly on that same level. More Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, but even Callum Smith is not a bad opponent. But Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant especially, they're pretty much on that same level. A certain amount of people look at them as above Demetrius Andrade or Jamal Charlo. Now, personally, would I say that Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant are above them? I would say that Caleb Plant, in my opinion, is the biggest threat to Canelo Alvarez in terms of the 160, 168 pound division. So personally, when we talk about talent, I believe that Caleb Plant probably is the biggest threat to Canelo Alvarez in those divisions. That's just personally my opinion. We can sit here all the live long damn day and say, well, you know, Caleb Plant, you know, he's just another Caucasian fighter, all sort of bullshit when it comes down to it. But bottom line is this, Caleb Plant, when we take a look at him and when we take a look at overall what he's accomplished, he's a real threat. And Caleb Plant, really, when we talk about it, and Billy Joe Saunders, they've accomplished just as much in their career as Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade have. And that's the problem. There's not going to be a lot of people that are going to say that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding these fighters because really, in my opinion, there's really no 100% intangible proof of that. I don't know how I can sit here and say that Canelo Alvarez is 100% avoiding these fighters, at least as of right now, when he's facing fighters that are somewhere near on the same level. And that's the problem. And that's what a certain amount of people who watch my videos, they're just not getting it. I'm not saying that Canelo Alvarez is not maneuvering somewhat. I'm not saying that he's never maneuvered around in the past. I'm not saying that there's not certain questionable fights that Canelo Alvarez has been in. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that every opponent that Canelo Alvarez faces is the opponent that I wanted him to face. I'm not saying that Avinio Durham or Rocky Fielding were more deserving of a title shot with Canelo Alvarez than Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andrade or David Benavidez. That's not what I'm saying. But if you want that fight with Canelo Alvarez, you have to try and separate yourself from that Billy Joe Saunders, from that Caleb Plant pack. Because just saying overall, well, they're Latino and black fighters, you know, why wouldn't that separate them from the pack? That's not going to do it. You know, that's not going to be enough to do it. You know, it is what it is. These channels are trying to use, you know, that racial excuse, all this other bullshit, basically to separate those fighters from the pack. But the bottom line is this: there's a certain amount of people that look at Caleb Plant as the best 168 pounder in the world, excluding Canelo Alvarez. Besides Canelo Alvarez, they look at Caleb Plant as the second most talented person in that division. So that's the problem. Caleb Plant, David Benavidez, Demetrius Andrade, Jamal Charlo, Billy Joe Saunders, they're all looked at as pretty much on a similar level. So as long as Canelo Alvarez is facing one of them next, there's not going to be that great of a demand for a Demetrius Andrade fight or a Jamal Charlo fight next. Now, I think a Jamal Charlo fight, I think that there's going to be more of a demand for that fight a little bit later on when it comes down to it, because Jamal Charlo is more well known when it comes down to it. Jamal Charlo has actually done himself some favors in the 154-pound division when he defeated J-Rock Williams. Now, he hasn't done himself any favors in the 160-pound division because he's faced really nothing but C-class fighters in the 160-pound division. But it is what it is when it comes down to it. Now, Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, what they're going to have to do, in my opinion, is that they're more than likely going to have to face each other. And from what I'm hearing, it is possible for this to happen later on in 2021, later on in 2022. And Demetrius Andrade especially is going to have to try and take some of these big fights, because I think the Canelo Alvarez versus Jamal Charlo fight, I think that fight is going to happen eventually. I don't have much doubt about that. I think that fight is going to happen eventually because Jamal Charlo, he's a pretty decently big name. There's a certain amount of people. He has a certain amount of a good fan base, not even just of his own demographic, and that's very decently important in boxing. You know, when you have a fighter that attracts a certain amount of demographics, not just one, when it comes down to it, that's a fighter that, you know, can get a lot of the big fights because you can put a certain amount of pressure on these other fighters. Demetrius Andrade is not really a fighter that has a great fan base outside of his super fans and outside of his demographic. And that's not me saying that Demetrius Andrade does not deserve more of a following, or overall that, he is not a very decent fighter. I think he is a very decent fighter. But if Demetrius Andrade wants that Canelo Alvarez fight, you're going to have to try and trap Jermall Charlo or David Benavidez in a corner, is what you're going to have to do. And in my opinion, what Demetrius Andrade is going to have to do is that he's either going to have to face Jermall Charlo or David Benavidez next. If you can trap Jermall Charlo in a corner, because I don't think Jermall Charlo really wants that Demetrius Andrade fight, but he might be forced to take that fight. We'll see what happens. If you can take that fight, that's a great fight. David Benavidez might even be a greater fight for you. If you're serious about facing Canelo Alvarez, first of all, from what I'm hearing from these rumors, from all these channels, Demetrius Andrade might sign with the PBC. He might sign with Showtime. I don't think that that's a bad idea, because Jermall Charlo is over there. If you can trap him in a corner, that's a great fight. Not only that, but let's say you beat Jermall Charlo. If you go up and you defeated David Benavidez, there's already going to be a certain amount of pressure on Canelo Alvarez to face David Benavidez, because they're both of Mexican descent. So there's going to be a lot of attention on that fight always. So if you can go to David Benavidez, and if you can outclass him, if you can beat him when it comes down to it thoroughly, especially, there's going to be a great amount of pressure on Canelo Alvarez to face Demetrius Andrade. There's going to be a great amount of pressure for that. But Demetrius Andrade needs to show me that he's serious about facing a David Benavidez. And Demetrius Andrade, to be honest with you, I think that he's made some moves. Excuse me. I think that he's made some moves overall to where it seems like he's interested in some of these big fights. But then there's been other times where I've really questioned his motivations. So we'll see what happens with that. I think that what Demetrius Andrade should do is that he should face a David Benavidez. I think overall that's what he should try to do. Get to David Benavidez before Jermall Charlo might get to him, or before Caleb Plant might fight him, something like that. If you were able to defeat a David Benavidez when he's still an undefeated fighter, that would attract a lot of attention. And that really makes you one of the prime, contenders that Canelo Alvarez would have to face next. And then if he keeps saying this shit to where, his style doesn't interest me, or, he doesn't fight nobody, then it's going to get exposed that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding a Demetrius Andrade. But right now he's facing fighters that have the same credentials, if not more credentials, than Demetrius Andrade. That's the problem when it comes down to it. So people are not going to like that when it comes down to it, but it is what it is. That's the way that I look at it. If Demetrius Andrade, once again, I don't state in my videos that Demetrius Andrade and Jermall Charlo overall don't deserve a Canelo Alvarez fight, or overall, that I wouldn't mind seeing those fights. But if they want that Canelo fight, they're going to have to face bigger names, and that is the bottom line. And a certain amount of people ain't getting that. Listen, if Demetrius wants that fight, he's going to have to either face a Jermall Charlo very soon, or he's going to have to face a David Benavidez very soon. If you defeat one of those fighters, I assure you, you're going to get a certain amount of a bigger following than what you had before. And then you're going to become one of the prime targets for Canelo Alvarez, or overall, you're going to become one of the bigger guys that could potentially face Canelo Alvarez, is what I'm going to say. And the fan base will push Canelo Alvarez to face you. Right now, good 75 to 80% of the people, let's be honest, how many people watching this video, do you really give a shit about a Canelo Alvarez versus Demetrius Andrade fight next? I mean, there's some of you overall that may not mind seeing it. Now, personally, I wouldn't mind seeing it. But when it comes down to, would I rather see a Demetrius Andrade fight over a Caleb Plant fight personally? No. Would I rather see him face Demetrius Andrade instead of Jermall Charlo? I mean, not really. It is what it is. Now, that's assuming maybe Canelo Alvarez will face Jermall Charlo later on down the line. Because Canelo Alvarez, the way that I hear him talk, he seems more interested to face a Jermall Charlo than he does a Demetrius Andrade. I think a part of Canelo does realize that Demetrius Andrade could bring some potential problems to him. But he's not going to face a Demetrius Andrade if Demetrius Andrade keeps facing these B and C class fighters. There's going to be not a high demand for that fight. And to get a Canelo Alvarez fight, if Canelo Alvarez does not seem overly interested in you, you're going to have a high demand. So it is what it is. Demetrius Andrade is not going to have a high demand with the fans for a Canelo Alvarez fight unless he defeats a Jermall Charlo or a David Benavidez. Possibly even both of them. So we'll see what happens. That would be my advice for Demetrius Andrade. And if he's not able to get either of those fighters next, no problem. Try to start off with the Chris Eubank Jr. first. Try to start off with the Danny Jacobs. Because, once again, man, I keep hearing the shit that Demetrius Andrade can't get any big fights. You tell me you can't get one? Like, you can't get a Chris Eubank Jr. next? Someone who seems to be willing to prove himself against a lot of these top guys? Like, nobody wants a shot with you? Like, come on, man. I'm not sure if I'm believing that, but it is what it is. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm rooting for Demetrius Andrade. I hope that he gets one of these big fights soon. But, I think that he's got to take this a little bit more intelligently. We'll see what happens. Anyways, I've said this before. I just thought that I would put it out there. But that's really about it for today. I think more than likely Canelo Alvarez is going to face Caleb Plant next. I think that that's a great fight. When it comes down to it, I think Caleb Plant is the biggest threat to Canelo in terms of the 160, 168 pound divisions. That's my personal opinion, but it is what it is. Anyways, we'll see what happens, when it comes down to it. It'll be very interesting if Canelo Alvarez wins that Caleb Plant fight, which I assume most likely he will. Overall, I believe that, he'll be completely unified in that division. We'll have to see what Canelo Alvarez goes for after that fight. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.